Good afternoon, North Carolina folks. This afternoon, we're going to get into some best practices um, and hope to help you improve your craft. As a teacher of career tech, we have, I think, one of the larger challenges we face is trying to stay current in our industry, that being our primary industry, whether that be law enforcement or fire, EMT, or similar, and at the same time having to stay current in pedagogical and educational practices. And that can make things really, really difficult for us because we're already, working 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week. We're already running from behind, trying to stay caught up. And particularly if you're trying to do Skills USA and you've got your lesson plans, and particularly if you've been having to coach, I mean, it's just hard to keep up with everything. And so I just want to take a second to go through some things and help you kind of hone in on your craft. And hopefully this is going to be beneficial to you. I want to start off with what I think is just something. You guys are going to be going back to school in a couple, 3 weeks. And I think last year, COVID really demonstrated one thing to us is how important relationships are and the substantial difference in students in which you have relationships with and don't have relationships with and their success. Um, in some environments where there was hybrid teaching going on, the students that were at school and had engagement with the teachers were doing far better than the students who were at home. Um, and I think just a big factor in that's relationships. I know as a teacher, one of my favorite parts was getting to know students and getting to know more about them. And, it's real special to a kid when you remember, that they have a dog, they have a younger sister, their dad's a policeman, or just whatever. Everything you can remember about a kid just matters. It's ironic. I'll see a student I haven't taught in 20 years, and I can still remember their life circumstances, but I can't remember their name. And so building relationships to me is paramount. I think there's nothing you can do that's more important. And because we're human, and that connectivity really helps. Now, rigor is another thing I want to address. I don't think we set our standards high enough, to be quite honest. I talked to a lot of teachers across the nation who teach at high level schools and at risk schools and super low level kids. And the consistent thing that I hear is that when you set the bar, the kids will usually achieve it. And I just encourage you I always told people, don't teach to the lowest common denominator. Don't look at the worst kid in your class. Teach to the most enthusiastic kid in your class, not your brightest, not your weakest, but the most enthusiastic. Teach to a level that really challenges them, and you'll be fine. And the other kids will meet that. I often had different standards in my room than the school had. And I think we can do that in our programs. We have a reason to. And then finally, relevance. I think our programs are extremely relevant. I think that these 3 R's for us, I think we have an easier time with this than say someone teaching language arts, because not everybody in language arts wants to be there, but most of our kids look to be there and have fun. But keep it relevant is always a lot of fun. So that's just the three basics of your perspective. When we talk about philosophies of education, this is the three core to me. And I just encourage you to love your kids to death, give them high standards, encourage them to achieve those high standards, but teach them things that matter to them. They deserve it. So next thing up is I want to remind you guys about imprinting. If I was to ask you what is this, it's extremely difficult. This is our kids. The first time we pull out a concept, we talk about, stare decisis. Oh my gosh, man. I remember the first time I heard that word. It was worse than this. It didn't even have color. And then as we begin to reiterate a subject or give them definitions or talk about things, it begins to imprint further and they begin to see things clearer. And then finally it gets to where they get it, they understand it, and that image is there. And then the more that we can do imprinting, the more we can get that clear focus and that long-term image in. And so when you have a student, you introduce them in a vocabulary, and then you go over it in a lecture, and then you have them read it in a reading material, and then you have them manipulate it in a project or manipulate it in a group assignment. Every time that student touches that information, that data, they become stronger, and that image becomes clearer, And then finally, when you look at this image long enough, if I take that image away, you might remember the number on the guy's back, not just the baseball. And so that's what we want with our students. You've got to really understand that when we can't do survey education where we just kind of throw stuff at kids in a drive-by fashion. It's not going to stick. The kids aren't spaghetti and they're not a wall. We have to have them manipulate the material, understand the material, then manipulate it, then use it, then study it, then apply it. And then also we have to make sure that we're intentionally, particularly with the big objects, that we're revisiting those concepts later on for there to be a long-term retention. Because right now you can memorize this photograph very, very well. But if I were to take this photograph away and not show it to you for a month, you might remember it was a guy playing baseball, but you know that you're going to forget the details. And this time next year, you're not going to remember anything about the picture. And so we need to make sure that the kids can continue to do that. And another really cool thing about the more that we can give them permanency in the concepts like stare decisis or case law or how to control bleeding and the way that, blood flow and blood pressure affects bleeding control, things like that. The more that we can really hone that in, then the more there's transition. And so that when you give them a new image that's similar, they're able to transfer that image relatively simple. And so while this ended up not being baseball and it's some random Irish sport, nonetheless, you were able to see in the first picture, oh, they're holding something. It's a bat. They've got protective gear on. They have a jersey. It must be sports. And that's the same thing we can do with our students as we impress into them this imprinting process and learning. And that requires a lot of repetition, but in new ways. Using that learning as the year goes on, not just leaving a unit back in the fall, but carrying that unit forward and the activities they do moving forward. They're going to begin to transfer that data and that knowledge. And really, I think the apex of learning for our students is the ability to transfer that what they know into things that they don't know and project that forward. And I think that's what we've got to do in our classrooms. And so just want to real quickly go over imprinting and transfer, because that explains a lot of the pedagogy I teach. And as you go through my lesson plans, you'll see that I see relationships and rigor as being very, very, and relevance as being very, very important to the things I did as a teacher. So we're going to go into lesson plans. If you guys will open this website, it's pretty easy, bit.ly/. Now that looks like a useless bunch of letters, but it's North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, Lapson. So bit.ly/NCDPI LASPN. Oh God, I'm dyslexic. I did Lapson. Do y'all see that? It's not LASPN, it's LAPSCN. God, I hope that's the actual link. Wouldn't that be funny if my dyslexia got the best of me? So I'm going to stop this for a moment and make sure that I did not do that wrong when I make the micro link. That would be embarrassing, except funny. So if you guys know me, actually, if you've heard my literacy talk today, I have really bad learning disabilities. Yeah, actually, that's funny. The Lapson is transposed. Oh my gosh, there's perfect evidence right there. So Laspen. How about Aspen, North Carolina there at the end? I mean, Aspen, Colorado. I am so sorry about that, guys. That is pretty funny. And the funny thing is I didn't even notice it when I was editing. Dyslexia is a really interesting thing, guys. I'm not going to lie. So, all right. So that just shows you that you can have a PhD and still not spell stuff right. That's the hope for, I always told my students when I taught them, I said, I graduated with honors. So, just because you misspell things. So it's bit.ly/North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, and then dyslexia hits, and it's LASPN. I apologize, or Laspen. Oh man, that's semi-embarrassing. All right, so we're going to go over the lesson plans that I teach. Let me drag these over. These are the lesson plans we use in Lapson. You've been seeing them this week with your 11, 41, and 42. The good thing about these is I'm not going to lie. They take time on the front end, and that definitely, if you talk to Josh, you talk to Kevin, you talk to Austin, they'll tell you these things take time, but they'll also tell you that the end product is phenomenal. And so I just encourage you to take a look at this and don't dismiss it right off the bat. When I first saw this lesson plan, I'm not going to lie, I was like, what? but as I've used it over time, I wish I had done it every year that I taught. So just, bear with me here and let me go through some things. The top of your lesson plan, and we'll have some templates of these if you want them on the website. You put your course and the unit and the duration of the unit, and then we get down to standards. And so the template's really useful. The good thing about this too is that there's not a county out there that I know of that we don't cover everything that's going to be on your lesson plans that your county demands. And using a Google form makes it collaborative. So let's go to the first thing. So you hear about supporting and priority standards, and there's so much in education that it comes from Mazzano, and you may love or hate Mazzano. What's really interesting is Mazzano is just like everything else in education. Somebody had this really great idea. It worked amazingly well at a school. They did it at another school. It worked amazingly well. Then somebody wanted to package it and send it out there and doesn't explain it and doesn't support it, and they just force you to do things, and then you're mad at the process, at the product. But the reality is, Mazzano is actually really, really good. I've been very impressed in some of the support materials I've read, and some of the information. So if you've done Mazzano in your school district, I hear a lot of people that just groan when they hear it because some school districts have made it painful, and I think that's terrible because his research is really good. So let's dismiss any biases we have toward the Mazzano material, and let me try to explain some things, because I also think it's interesting that we always end up doing things and not understanding where they come from. So what a priority standard is, it actually makes complete sense. In a given year, you're going to teach 12, 14 standards. Each of those standards have sections under them, depending upon what your language is of the taxonomy. You have the name of the section, and then you have the standard, the section, and then the sub threads or the subsections, whatever you call them. The interesting thing about those is as you go through them, there's ones you want your kids to be exposed to, but more importantly, there's ones that you need them to carry forward more so than the rest. So we're not saying in supporting and priority standards that there's standards we should ignore. In fact, we can't ignore standards. What we're saying is that the standards that are going to carry forward, the things that you're going to use next year or next semester in your next level class, or the thing that the student is going to have that they need to have for to understand that next level of instruction. That's what a priority standard is. And so, for example, in intro, we'll talk about something like crime statistics. I guess those carry on though, but something like Eighth Amendment. Well, not Eighth Amendment, like Seventh Amendment, Ninth Amendment. That's a good example. We teach the kids about Second and Third Amendment and Seventh Amendment, Ninth Amendment. We really don't revisit those later. They need to know them on a test. Honestly, if they forget them, I'm not that worried. But what they do need to really understand is the Fourth, the Fifth, the Sixth, the Eighth, the 14th, right? And so that would be an example of priority. Understanding Fourth Amendment, understanding the case laws, the Fourth Amendment, those are things they're going to carry into our law enforcement class and to our forensics class and we all don't have forensics, but and your protective services classes and all those other things. And fire science, fire triangle, fire tetrahedron, whatever thing's called. That's something they're going to hear their entire career. So that would be a priority standard. Whereas I remember when I taught my kids the knots, there were a couple of knots that I was told by the fire guys, yeah, we teach them that, but they never really use them. These are the 2 or 3 that are really important. That's kind of an example on that side. I mean, there's the knots you're going to use throughout your entire 3 courses and your time as a firefighter. And there's a couple of knots we teach you just to teach you the knots. So that's kind of a priority standard. A supporting standard are those other standards that still, support the priority, because honestly, we do teach the entire Bill of Rights, and we do want the kids to understand the kind of the holistic approach to those initial civil rights and why they were there and their order and justification. But there's only the real ones moving forward we need them to know. And so when we look at standards, don't be dismissive of the non-priority. And let me show you that on here. And so here's our priority standards. And this is a unit that I made. This is overview of LPSCS instruction unit. This is in our intro class. This will be on the website eventually. It might even be on there by the time you guys watch this. But there were the main standards, there were the priority standards, and then the supporting standards. And the supporting standards are okay. Like, rank, that's a good example. Sure, they're going to use rank, but pretty important how they know that the agencies work together. So there's the priority standards versus supporting standards. Now, the next thing I want to cover is probably the least understood part of, of lesson planning of classes. I feel pretty comfortable. I can say that all of you have to have your essential questions posted on the board, and they're kind of, they I remember we started doing them at my school. Nobody really knew. They were just out of the blue. You have to have essential questions. We had no training on it. Nobody knew what an essential question was. Then we came around and people from the county critiqued us because we didn't have the right ones, or they didn't like they were worded, and we got mixed signals on what they were supposed to be, and that's sad because an essential question is actually really important. So I want to explain to you what an essential question is, if you and give you a theory behind it. 20 years from now, you bump into your student. 20 years from now, you see that they're working on the job, or 20 years from now, they're a fire chief, or 20 years from now, another paramedic. What do you hope they remember from this unit of instruction, right? I always felt, just because of my background, that police officers had a really weak understanding of case law, of how the Supreme Court decisions it made an impact, common law, into our everyday policing. And so I think I kind of really taught a lot of common law and case law to my students. And I do run into my students 20 years later. In fact, I ran into one. He's now the really high up with Roswell Police Department. And we were talking, and he said, what he told me, that a lot of stuff that I taught them, he still used every day. That's what an essential question should lead to. When we're doing, it's called backwards design by some people. What we're doing is you look at the standards, you read them, and you say, what do I really want these kids to be able to really say in 20 years right off the top of their head? You know, and I think sometimes where I really got an epiphany on this was I had been doing some research on my students, and it was when we first started doing end of pathway testing in Georgia. And I got to the end of the pathway, and kids did not remember stuff that was really important that we had taught just a year earlier, 2 years earlier. It was about the time that I, on my own, began to study essential questions. I got a book called Backwards Design from a friend, and just really got into that. I just really thought this is really genius. So let me kind of really quickly tell you a little bit about backward design. So when I started teaching, actually I taught special ed one year, and then I came in and started teaching law and public safety. But when I got law and public safety, I got the Introduction to Criminal Justice textbooks from Glencoe McGraw-Hill back then. And they had a test generator, and I generated a test, and they actually had some elementary PowerPoints at the time. And I just taught the textbook, and then when I got done, my lesson plan said, well, what standards did you address? This is also back, we had QCCs, and we had 170 items, and I would just go find the ones that fit and stick them in the end, and go on to the next test and the next standard. And ironically, I won teacher of the year for my county, and I was runner up for my state, and everybody thought I was this great teacher. And then a few years later, I read Backward Design, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know what the heck I'm doing. So backward design is, you look at the standards first. You get your standards, and I've done this with y'all standards, and actually 41 and 42 were developed this way. 11 was kind of already developed because we had the national capstone test material ready. But we clustered standards around what made sense to go together, and then we created the units from those. And so when you look at those standards and you read, there's maybe 2 or 3 or maybe 5 of them, the subsections and everything, you need to ask yourself, what is it that I want these kids to know? What's the most important thing they know in 20 years? Then maybe list a few more. And then from that, it's called backward design because you start with the end in mind. You start with what you want them to know in the end. The next question is, how do you know when they know that? Right. And so that's an assessment question, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then you need to figure out a way for them to demonstrate that they know that. Again, that's kind of more an assessment. And then from the assessment, you work backwards to, how can I instruct that? And it was a hard lesson for me. I had really designed some great, what I thought were amazing lesson plans with great PowerPoints and activities based upon that model of just grabbing what was in the textbook, letting the textbook chapter lead me through what I was doing. I had to throw all that out and start over. I didn't throw it all out. We cut and pasted some pieces, but definitely had to do some major reorganization. So with backwards design, we've already done this for you guys, but that's where essential questions come from is if at the beginning of something, I tell you, hey, by the end of this unit, you're going to know this, then that one begins to give you an idea of where we're going. I like to write essential questions in a way that the students are interested in what the outcome is. When I taught Georgia criminal code, my essential question was, can I get away with that? Kids love that. I mean, I remember putting on the board, they're like, can I get away with that? Huh, can I get away with this? And it did spark, because we call that cognitive dissonance. That's where you spark their interest. You give them something that they don't know and they want to know. That's cognitive dissonance. It's a lot of your TV series right now, like Netflix does that. They'll start off with the end and then go back to the beginning. And then you're like, wait, how did it get to the end? That's cognitive dissonance in cinema. But cognitive dissonance in education is giving a student something that they're suddenly curious about and they really want to learn it. And so what do you want your kids to remember in 20 years? And so in my units, I tend to provide a lot of essential questions. Um, and so that's because I tended to use these as I went through sections of my instruction. Some school systems, for some reason, restrict you to one. Some school systems demand that you have, five. There shouldn't be a number. There should be, how many do you need? How many questions do you want them to be able to answer in 20 years? And then work backwards from there. So, what is jurisdiction? That is actually pretty important. How does private security fit into law and public safety? Core operational strategies. It's interesting. I did not know what core operational strategies was when we got new curriculum, and they're pretty important. I do think you need to remember what the ranks are, and so learning, understanding accountability. So these are things that we are, 20 years from now, what our kids need to know. And so in that backwards design, really the essential question is kind of what the kids will be able to answer at the end. And then you'll ask them a year later, and hopefully they still remember the answers. Now, everything else in the unit, it doesn't just get thrown out. I mean, we're still going to teach it. There's still stuff that I want my students to know. But the difference between in-house security and proprietary versus contract. If a kid goes on and majors in protective services, they're going to learn that in more detail. I'm going to expose it to them in intro, but if they don't remember that in a year, I'm not going to cry. But if a year later they can't explain to me how private protective services or private security agencies work into the overall system, then I am kind of upset about that. So that's kind of what essential questions are. Um, then we have targets, right? And these targets are for the students. And so what we're going to start looking at is called student-friendly targets. Now, I've been around since Noah got off the ark, and we used to have all kinds of terrible statements, learning objectives and stuff, and they were written really god awful. I mean, just and then nobody ever really checked them. I love the student-friendly learning targets. It's so much easier as a teacher to know when I get done, a student can say, I can understand the different roles of agencies within LPSCS. That's a heck of a lot easier, isn't it? The student can identify, I can identify this. It's from a student perspective. It's just what can the student say at the end? I can tell you the different goals of the agencies. I can tell you what each of my local agencies are in charge of. Pretty cool, right? I love those so much more. When they converted over to these, I was pretty pleased. It is interesting that some districts still use learning objectives, and you have to have like student will be able to identify yada yada and 80%. I think I hope you're not in that district. So that's student-friendly learning targets. Really, really, really love those. And then, sorry, let's talk about vocabulary. Now, I mentioned this in the literacy video. If you watched that earlier, we're in the Q&A. But the vocabulary, I want to reiterate, nothing is more important than giving the kids the vocabulary, because if you don't give them the vocabulary, they can't learn. It's easy for us to remember, if you've been a cop for a long time or you've been a firefighter for a long time, there's words that you just use on a regular basis from industry that people don't know. I always use the example of discretion. Outside of law enforcement and legal circles, I don't think anybody uses the word discretion. But there's a lot of words like that we use that, like, felony and misdemeanor. A kid who's never been around this stuff, they're not going to have any idea what that is. Protocol, that's a term, the protocols between agencies. What does that word mean? So we have to make sure the kids get the foundations. This is very structural. So in foundational learning, it talks about giving them the foundation, then scaffolding, and then roofing. That's the idea of that model. I agree with the model. It's a really useful way to talk about things. Foundation, any foundation to any house has got to be a strong vocabulary when you're structuring a unit. Got to make sure these kids get it. And so, in the ways that kids learn, and the way you start off with the word itself, they need to understand how to pronounce it. How many times I remember, occasionally I'll run into a word that I've never heard said before, like paradigm. I remember the first time I heard somebody say the word paradigm, I had been saying in my head when I was reading it, paradigm. I mean, I'm sure some of y'all are laughing because you probably did the same thing. And then somebody says paradigm, and you're like, well, what's a paradigm? And then you see it on a PowerPoint slide. You're like, oh, I'm not so dumb to say that out loud. That's how you say paradigm. Okay. So it helps the kids with the structure of the word. It helps them also. Some kids are very good at decoding words using suffixes and prefixes and those kinds of things. And so, starting off with a word search, while people with dyslexia like me hate the things, it is a fantastic way to learn how a word is spelled, get introduced to the word, how the word's structured. Then crosswords. This is something I got from a literacy teacher a number of years ago. Having the students, don't let them go find their definitions, give them the definitions in the crossword. That makes them use the word again. Now they're still breaking down the word language. They're still using the letters and figuring that out, counting it because they're trying to see if it fits in the boxes, right? And then they connect that definition that you want them to have with the word, because you can have words that have multiple meanings to different people, and you want to make sure that they're getting the word as it pertains, like protocol. Protocol probably has different meanings in different industries, but with us, it's a series of rules between agencies, right? Protocols. So you want to make sure that they're getting the right word. Suppression in fire is, fire suppression. Suppression in social studies is suppressing people groups. So there's a good example. We don't want them to be memorizing a definition for, when a minority group is kept from their rights. We want them to know when you put out a fire, right? So that's or reducing the fuel of a fire. So that's a good example of why the crosswords are important. Then I have them they take the crossword definitions and write them on flashcards. And I talked about some literacy a little bit. Quizlet's okay, but I think it's better for them to have the physical cards just because they have to write it again. Remember, we talked earlier about imprinting. So every time, so the kids use the word in a word search, the kids use a word in a crossword. Now they've attached it to a definition. Now they're writing on a flashcard. Now they're flipping the flashcard. Every single time they're doing that, it's getting deeper and deeper and deeper into their brain. Also, another thing that I didn't mention earlier in this, the more parts of the brain you can engage. I hope y'all understand that the brain is not just one singular organ. There's series of levels of understanding that involve multiple portions of the brain. So the more that you can get them to physically say the word, mentally read the word, that's two different ways, writing the words a different way, using it in a sentence, all of these employ different operation parts of the brain. So the more that you use different sensory, speaking, writing, talking, debating, all of that ends up engaging into a deeper imprint of the terminology into the student mind. And then there's a number of other methods. If you go research vocabulary acquisition, teaching vocabulary, you'll see that there's worksheets you can do where they break down the definition of the word, do antonyms, synonyms. I think that's the flashcard that Josh Clark introduced to us. If you'll look on literacy, I had the name of that flashcard method, and it's also on our literacy page. So if you go to lapson.org/literacy, I know I have a link to that. And so there's other methodologies that you may like more. But what's ironic? You remember, if you old school folks remember this, I don't think they've tortured kids like this in a while. We used to have to write our spelling words like 50 times. And people are like, that's just tragic. But you know what it was? If you write a word 50 times, you know how it's spelled. It's beginning to imprint the word. But anyway, then you do need to evaluate the students, have some basic understanding before you move forward in the unit. I encourage you to allow the students to quiz until they pass, and even re-quiz. Maybe a few days later, give the kids a quiz again. It's just like a pop quiz, just to make sure they're constantly using those quizzes up. I mean, the reusing the language, and then have them use the words. Have them do project-based learning or something where they're using the terminology when they're doing the review sheets and they're writing the review up for the test. They're going to be using those words again. So just really quick, that's just a kind of an overview on vocabulary. If you Google vocabulary in the classroom, there's tons of ideas. So sometimes the kids will know things like juvenile. They probably know that. but they probably don't know solicitor or proprietary. That's a word a lot of our kids aren't going to know. And so very important. Now in your advanced units, you're going to have scaffold academic vocabulary. This is an early unit. Um, but particularly like in your second year class, what are words you need them to remember or remind them of? So let's say that's fall, or your second semester, you're starting over, like maybe you're going into policing, your intermediate policing class. You want to have them remember what felony misdemeanor is. You may want to remind them what jurisdiction is. And so you may have to have some scaffolding activities where they just use the vocabulary, read, could even just be just some definition sheets, just to bring them back and out of that imprinting element. And that's what the academic or scaffolding academic vocabulary is. Some teachers also like to add words that are just good for the students to know. I remember we had like 50 words we had to add to our students every semester for testing. You can throw those in there and do different vocabulary activities on those as well. So here is our bus driver assessment, and here's the bus called instruction. And I know I know that's kind of cheesy, but the instruction drives the bus, guys. Assessment drives the bus. It's critical that you get this. Informal assessment can be something as simple as thumbs up, thumbs down. You can ask them to raise 4 fingers in the air, 3 fingers in the air. I had dry erase boards that I cut out of tub board at a Lowe's or Home Depot, and they use dry erase markers on the tub board. I've seen teachers use all kinds of things. There's cool apps now that you do these little papers they hold up and it automatically scans their results, and you can do the quiz games, and there's a million ways to assess. Sometimes it's just as simple as randomly calling on a kid in class and saying, what's so and so. So I want to remind y'all that assessment tells you where you are in your instruction. So if you give, for example, a vocabulary quiz and the test average is a 40, you need to go back and make sure that don't go forward. You're not doing yourself a favor trying to save time. Well, I can't go back. This lesson plan has to end in 7 days. And well, the kids aren't going to do any better going forward if they don't have the basics. It's foundational learning. You got to get back and get those basics in, right? Now, I do agree with some of y'all and myself. I would give you that in certain circumstances where kids have to commit things to memory, like in a unit test, sometimes it's not that you didn't teach it, it's just they never bothered to learn it. But in that gives us a problem. We have to get these kids to learn it somehow. And so, and in that is one of the secret essences to being a good teacher is finding out how to get your kids prepared for tests and assessments, and making sure you can assess what they learn. And during the course of the year, making sure that they maintain that concept. But what assessment needs to be a regular part of your classroom. And I'll tell you, because I've been around since Noah and Moses. We used to not do that at all. We would have a unit. We might have a couple of homework assignments or a reading assignment, and then we would have the test. And that's when we found out if the kids got it or not. And then boom, suddenly the class average was 61, and we just went on to the next unit. That's a terrible way. That's why my kids didn't know stuff 2 years later. So it's easy for us to get mad at the kids, but it's humanity as a whole. This is how we learn. So we got to find ways to these kids can get some retention. So as you're coming into our unit plans that we're going to be working on, you will see that we have these assessments laid out in the front and some ideas of what, I break mine up by formative and summative. Some of the teachers are just listing them. And you can add to them obviously, but and most of these are more the formal. I tend to have my informal in my PowerPoints. If you use any of my PowerPoints, you'll see like questions and answers and stuff inside the PowerPoints. And I recommend that because that way you remember as you're designing your instructional materials, put in them stuff to remind you to ask questions, do you get this? And thought questions and such. All right. So proficiency scales is the last thing we're going to review before I really get into the content of how to look through the lesson plan. If you've not learned about proficiency scales, I put about a 50-50 shot that in 5 years we won't be using grades. And to be honest, when I first heard that about 8 years ago from a really great principal that I was under, I balked. I was like, "Oh, you're crazy! How else are we going to grade kids?" I mean, it's been a 100-point scale since Moses, and trust me, I was there when he tested me on the Pentateuch. Everything's out of 100, and you have 20 questions, therefore they're each worth 5. And why? Have you ever thought about that? Pretty much because it's easy math, I think. Proficiency scales are a completely different way to look at things. It is back to that question: what do they need to know in 20 years? How do we know they know it? And so a proficiency scale tells us how well they know it. And so that's why they're kind of important. Now, typically, most programs are not using a one. That's below proficient. This is the learning how to ride the bike. And so, that's the kid on the tricycle. My proficiency scales are 2, 3, 4. Now, your county may require a 1, 2, 3, 4, but we just we're going to keep it to 2, 3, 4. Two is they're getting there. The kids got training wheels, but they're on the big boy bike. They just need to learn a little bit more balance or something. Two is something that everybody in your class needs to achieve before you even think about going into the next unit. If you don't have people pass at two or higher, you got to slow down. You just going forward, you're literally putting that child in the dust, and they're never going to catch up. Now, if it's a situation where kids passive aggressive, or I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the kids that are part of the class and doing what they can. Three is the goal. Three is where you want 90+% of your kids to fall. And that's where they can pretty much ride the bike. All right. They can ride the bike. They can ride the bike over the hill. They can ride a bike around a curve. They can stop and start. That's good. Four are those kids that just go ahead and above. And really, I said earlier, you want 90% of three. You want 10% at four or more. You want them to be able to not only ride the bike, but be able to do a wheelie or be able to do a trick on it, or just take it a step beyond. And so that's proficiency scales. And proficiency scales are something you'll learn if you Google them when you first start to write them. And I'll tell you about these lesson plans as a whole, and I've told everybody that's ever done them. First time I did one of these lesson plans, it probably took me, let's just say it was 100x. The second time I did one, it took me 70x. And then the third time, 50x. And then it just got to where I could knock these things out. So proficiency scales were a big part of that slowdown in my learning curve. So I start with the middle. I go to what should we know to demonstrate that they know enough to say they got it. And then I look at what would be, the kid that's really like, wow, you got it. You learned above and beyond. And then I went and stepped back down and I looked at where are they close. I didn't look at where they failing. I'm looking at where's the kid that's just about there. And that can be difficult. Now, I've seen some proficiency scale requirements of being 6 and 8 items. I've seen, and again, I question school systems that put metrics on things. I know why they do it, because they're worried we're going to be lazy teachers. If administrators will worry more about other things, that'd be great. But nonetheless, they'll give us numbers. I think you need the numbers necessary. And most of my scales, I did 2 items on each or 3 items on each. I saw some of my lesson writers from North Carolina and Georgia have put 6 and 7, and that's fantastic. If you can dig into the meat of this and expand these, please do. That's going to definitely help you out. All right. So now we're going to go in and look at the lessons for a few minutes. So on mine, you'll see to be really careful. Make sure you make a copy. I think most of my stuff's set up that way, but I've actually had teachers go in and change stuff, and yeah, it's frustrating. Let's talk about lesson plans. This is a discussion that I've had with a lot of folks. You've heard what's the longest amount of time a student can sustain attention, and you've probably heard their age plus 5. So let's just take the average age of our kids, 15, 16 plus 5. It's about 20 minutes. I think that's wrong now. That statistic actually came from a study done back in 1984. I was in high school in 1984, and I think 20 minutes was about the max I could pay attention. Today, with our kids, the phones, Twitter's 140 characters, just everything's so fast paced. I don't know if you can keep a kid for 20 minutes doing the same thing. I suggest that you think about lessons as Lego blocks, right? So each of my little Lego blocks is 15 minutes, 10 to 20, right? 15 minutes. And I just stack them together, and I can unstack them. We have a fire drill. I just snap that one off, put it into tomorrow. It helps you with time management. It helps you with interruptions in class. Also, by breaking your segments into 20 minutes, 15-minute segments, it forces you to be a good teacher. It makes you mindful that that's the maximum your student can handle. When we designed these, however, I had a number of teachers particularly in North Carolina, that were on block with 90 minutes roughly, and they asked could they do roughly 30 minutes, and I said, yeah, for this project, 30 minutes is fine. But I had a number of folks that wanted to come in and do our lesson plans, and we just don't do them because you will see. Let me put a caveat on that. It's difficult to break a test up. If you've got a regular testing day, it takes the kids about 45 minutes to take a test. I get that. But other than formalized assessment like that, I don't think any of your activities should exceed 20 to 30 minutes max. And now you may say, well, wait, Dr. Washburn, I've got this really great PowerPoint and I lecture for one day and then the next day they do stuff. I would encourage you to break those segments into segments. And you'll see if you go through and look at my materials, I'm going to hopefully have some of these up for y'all to share. You've got a link to this one. I did go back and break them up and broke each of the PowerPoints into no more than 20 minutes. And like CERT, you get the CERT materials. They're 70 slides. I broke all those down. I broke them into segments. I gave them activities in between each one. Let me see if hope I'm right on this. Yeah, so when they come in on this, yeah, here's structure notes. That's to remind me about stuff. And then see what I do is I actually put in my PowerPoints, this is day one. Here's day two, which was the vocabulary pack. And then we go over jurisdiction and victues. There's think about it. That's what I was telling you I do informal assessment. We use the whiteboards like name a jurisdiction. And then we have another one like, if there's a crazy guy with a machete in a burning house, who's in charge? I get the funniest responses. I had one kid that was an explorer with fire. And he said, well, just let the firefighters hit him with the water hose. He'll drop that machete real quick. Todd laughing because I was like, you know what, you're right. And as a cop, I appreciate you. And then you'll see that like I have a video that I already have. This is a link. I download the videos in advance. And that way I don't have to worry about the internet being down or anything like that. And then these little things in my PowerPoints, you see that's letting me know that I'm on another part of another segment of my lesson plan. And so you see that I did this portion and then they watch a video and then I have my next portion and they'll see a video and we'll go over operational strategies. Y'all do know on PowerPoints, there's nothing there because you need to download it. It'll show up when you download it. And so we'll go over this portion. And as you see, like here's the whiteboards again. I asked the kids just something to break it up. Hey, would you like to be a cop? 1, no way. 3, maybe. 5, heck yeah. And then we do a scavenger hunt. And that's what this thing is. And if you download this, you'll see the link there. And so each of these are sections that are 15 minutes in duration. And if you notice, I drop in my whiteboards, you could do that with them writing on a sheet of paper or whatever. And these little asterisks remind me the days. And so that was day 3. Okay. And then I get into, and I have my little blanks in, and it's just how I keep up with my day. I keep up with what we've been through. I can pace myself. If I get down here and I didn't make it to day 4 end, I'm over here, then I know the next day I've got to kind of jump on the ball at the bell. And so that's just kind of the way I organize my PowerPoints. I put in my PowerPoint all the reminders to myself so I don't forget to ask them assessment questions and things like that. I did want to show y'all for a literacy perspective. I talked to y'all earlier about adding things into Add Literacy. Here's a great example. I have an article on a group of police cadets that got fired. Now, granted, this was a while back, but they cheated on a test and everybody got fired. And then it's a quick article and they do a main idea organizer. Hopefully this works. And they just basically 3 main ideas from the article. So, and it's a thing to introduce them to the concept that public safety gets held to a higher standard. So as you'll go through my PowerPoint, through my lesson plans, let me go back up to going this in the middle. I leave teacher notes to myself. Notice that I've got the video, I've got the slides. I do what the assessment's going to be, which is they're going to be doing the job details group assignment. I do require, and one thing I'd like for you to do in your lesson plans is intentionally identify student engagement. I get a little pushback on this because it takes time, but if you're not actively thinking about what your student is doing and thinking, then you're not lesson planning. You're basically outlining your performance, but you're not doing anything to identify what your student response is going to be. And so you want to make sure that they're engaged. I also have student interactions here. So they're engaged and they're interacting, critical. And then the reminders is sometimes blank, but it's just for example, here, this is a note to myself that, I might have a student that's hostile toward police. I need to be patient about their life experiences and things. And then on this side is what you need to start class. one thing you're going to find out if you do these lesson plans, first time you do them, they're brutal. I'm not going to lie. I will not lie, but I tell you what, they're so worth it. It's like I'm losing weight right now. If you know me, I'm a Sasquatch. I'm huge. And the first 3 weeks on my diet, I had to eat this just diet I couldn't stand. But now it's worth it because I'm losing a ton of weight. And so that's the way these lesson plans are. You're going to invest a lot of time, but the outcome, the second year, you're asking the guys that wrote these lesson plans this year, this time next year, was it worth it? They're all going to be like, oh my gosh, it was the smartest thing I ever did. When I started doing these lesson plans, and I did these the last year I taught, talk about tough to motivate. When you've done something the same way forever. But we were doing them for posterity. I was leaving it behind for the people in my county. Um, I was jealous, because the next year they've got everything written out, everything telling them exactly what to do, what to have ready. And even at the end, I gave them at the end, we have our pacing guide. Here's day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and each of the segments in the order. Those are all 1 days because they're guest speakers. And it's really cool when you finish one of these. Josh Clark and I were talking about it, and Kevin Matthews and I too. And once you understand these things, they really make you they demand that you be a good teacher, and your kids deserve that. You deserve that. You deserve to be the best professional you can be. You guys have the advantage that we've already created a lot of this for you. But I encourage you to use these formats down here at the bottom, because I'm wanting to keep on a time here. We have some interventions. For right now, these are kind of standard. What I would love to get from y'all over time is ways that you've adapted things, ways you've made it easier for students with special needs. Maybe you have an ESL school with a lot of kids and this is second language. Love to have some ESL products in here. If y'all can send them to me, we'll attach them to any of the lesson plans. That would, y'all remember Lapson, the N is network. You've heard me say that earlier in the week. Lapson, the N is network. We're the network. We're when those language arts teachers go into their department meeting, they're able to network. This is your department meeting. So you don't go to the department meeting every week and never take anything. You don't ever give back. You always give back. And so help share with us. Give us some materials, ways you've accommodated kids with special needs. I had a kid one year that was hearing impaired. I had to adjust a lot of my lessons because, for example, we had we were going to do it was weird, but they were going to do a live TV news broadcast, and they had to do like they were live at the scene. Well, this student couldn't do that because she couldn't hear. And so what was really cool was she actually did it in sign language, and we had an interpreter who spoke the sign. It was really cool. It was a flip, but I had to make that's not the only. I had a ton of adjustments I had to make. Like we did the radio communications unit. How do you do that with a deaf person? So, if someone's doing that out there, man, share it with us so we can make it better. And then here's exceeding the standards. This isn't a lot of my materials. This is just for those kids that finish early and they want to learn more. You'll see that in a lot of my lesson plans. We hope to add these to all of our units in the enrichment section, things that the kids can go further. Also additional information, just notes like here at I'm reminding myself, this is a long unit, but it's really cool. Here's a connection to Skills USA. You can talk about competition connections. And then at the end, I do pacing. We do pacing in 50, 55-minute class periods because it's the most common in the country. And so you'll find that even in the North Carolina lesson plans, the pacing's based on 50, 55 minutes. So which really could be probably it's more closer to 45 because they're breaking up 90-minute blocks in half. So just this is for you as a guide. The first time you do this program, the course, you'll use this time frame. But what I want you to do as you go through this is cut your own copy, make a copy, and then you adjust this to your to the way you taught it. All right. So that's kind of the lesson plan in a nutshell. I wanted to talk about a couple of more things. So I want to talk about reflective practice, and this is so essential to being a good teacher and growing as a teacher. I actually was national board certified. I was the first career tech teacher, the first batch of career tech teachers in the nation that were national board certified. I was the first law and public safety teacher national board certified. That's how old I am. And I tell you what, that national board process was a heck of a lot of work, but it is I learned more in national board than I learned in my master's and maybe my specialist. I'm not going to lie. I learned more in my PhD, but national board made me a heck of a better teacher. And this is just in a nutshell what I learned. You start off by planning your lesson plan. Okay. That's what I just kind of reviewed with you. So when you download these, don't just go with them and never change them. Don't be lazy like that. Custom it into yourself. Put your own materials that you like back in there. Look at the stuff we have, improve it, and plan it. And I would usually do this the day before I started a unit, 2 days before I started a unit. I would put on my Google Calendar my pacing, so it was on my Google Calendar. I posted. We posted a lot in there. We had a virtual classroom before COVID, and just gave them stuff in advance, and let them know we were going and what our plans were. Put that plan really well. Get it really laid out. Get your pacing down. I got so after y'all got to understand. I taught this, like I said, intro like over 100 times. I actually had the copies that I had a little binder, a little folder that was stuff that I sent to the copier, and then I would go copy it, print it out, and I already have the entire unit printed up the first day of class. I mean, I was that organized. For forensics, I had a list of all the materials I needed to order a month in advance. The more organized you get for that, the more you'll love yourself the next year. Just trust me. And particularly for you guys doing Skills USA and coaching, man, this is stuff that just really helps. Then you teach it. And as you're teaching it, you're doing your best, rolling it out. You're going to go into days where you're 10 minutes into class and you're like, this is a mess. And welcome to reality. That happens, right? Sometimes you have to fix you have to put some duct tape on the wings, right? When you're flying. Hopefully not. Hopefully your teaching plan will go okay. And then you want to evaluate. So the day the kids are taking your test, that's a really good day to evaluate the unit. Did kids get it? How are they performing on the test? The way you taught it. If your performance on your test is low, you just need to really kind of go through that and why. And I use students. I usually did about every 2 or 3 months. I'd get a panel of students in my room, bribe them with a pizza lunch. They'd come in during lunch. I would always get one of my most obstinate but intelligent kids, the ones that just kind of really a pain in your butt. I use them. I get like my super achiever kid, and then just a couple of the kids I knew would talk to me and they didn't mind sharing their opinions. And I just say, hey, what did you think about the last couple of months? And what's interesting about doing that? They'll be really honest with you. To be careful, have a thick skin because they'll hurt your feelings. I had this one project I love, Somerville. I talk about it all the time. I thought it was a genius thing. They were new police chiefs and they were trying out all these new things and they did this, that, and the other thing. And I thought it was awesome. I spent just a ton of time making the thing. I made maps and I made zones. I mean, just everything. And first time I did a student evaluation on it, they hated it. They absolutely hated it. I mean, even like my kid, you got the butt kiss. He hated it. So I said, well, what was bad about it? I tried to fix it next year, did the review. They hated it. And one of the kids said, it wouldn't be so bad if you did this, you do this. The other kids said, yeah, do this, do this. Well, by the time they got tearing it apart and throwing it back at me, it was a completely different thing. Started all over. End of the story. Next year, they loved it. Somerville was gone. It was in the trash can, but it's fit the Phoenix from the Flames was a much better lesson plan. So, in this evaluation tool, ask your students for feedback, informally, just a conversation, see how they liked it. I usually didn't bring stuff up in class though, because you just end up with kids, end up being a gripe fest. But like if let's say all your kids met your class average is 60 on a test, pull in a couple of your kids to the side, say, hey man, what happened? And what's interesting is sometimes they'll be very honest. One time I had a test. I thought I'd done really well in the unit and everything. And the kids, I did not put two and two together. The night before the test, our soccer team went to state and was in the state final round for playoffs. And all the kids admitted that they'd gone to the game and hadn't studied. Well, that was easy. So I just told the kids, I'm throwing the scores out. Let's take the test again Monday, which normally I don't give tests on Monday because kids notoriously do terrible on Mondays. And it went up to like an 83. So sometimes you find out you're not a bad teacher. And then when you get all this digest, just sit down. Maybe you're in traffic. In Atlanta, we have a lot of traffic. Time to think. Before I go to bed, I tend to stir things through my head. I know that's probably not a good thing for most people, but for me, it's actually calms me down. And I like to really fold it, mull it, and think about it. I've also got a fellow teacher, Tim Hart, who we've taught together, and we'd sit down over lunch and really just spend a couple of days going over the unit, particularly in intro. We both taught it together, and we really crafted a good intro course over several years because then we want to go back and we want to improve it. And then the next year, leave yourself. This is the big thing ever. Notes always. Take notes as you're planning. I had a legal pad. I don't know if it'll show up in the frame. Legal pad. I still have one on my desk. It's not. It's there. It is. I keep notes on it all the time. And I would jot down, it needs to be fixed. I need to add that to the order sheet. I need that to what's being copied. As I was teaching, I'd be like, that thing flopped. Oh, I need to make that better. That link's dead. The evaluation, I'd drop notes down when the kids were talking to me, and consideration, me and Tim would be talking. I put stuff down. And then I would go back and I would take that lesson plan, the one I just showed y'all, recraft it, improve it. I'd fix it then while it's fresh in my head. And then I'd put it away and start the next unit. And I know that's a lot of work, but let me tell you what, by the third year that we did this with our intro class, when Tim and I were teaching it, I'm not going to lie, we had a hell of a lesson. I mean, it was a solid year. Our test performances went up. Our students loved the class. I mean, we had a class that our kids just loved. It was easy to teach. By my third year, I went from, I could get to school 30 minutes before class started. I was gone by the time 30 minutes into the day, the whole year, except for Skills USA, getting ready for state and stuff, because I'd invested that time on the front end and done a good job and done a lot of evaluation, taking a lot of notes. When I got done, I had a fantastic product. So reflective teaching makes you a better teacher, but in the end, you end up with a better lesson plan as you go forward. And then I got to where I taught it several years. And I will admit, the last year I taught, I would go and open a lesson plan with one class, the one we're doing. I just showed you, we were redoing my last year, but forensics, my last year, I even had gotten to where I didn't make copies. I'd made it where I shared everything with the students digitally. They answered on Google Sheets and used Google Forms. I had probably 70% of my assessments grade themselves. Yeah, that's where you get. So, like I said, I'm on this diet where I eat crap for 3 weeks and I hate my life. But then I start losing weight like crazy. And in the end, I end up losing the weight I need to lose, hopefully over time. That's the way teaching is, guys. Take that time. We have given y'all a running start. Y'all have IP 11, 41, and 42. So if you're in law enforcement, you've got the foundation, and these are good lesson plans. We chose some guys and gals that knew what they were doing, and then you take that stuff and make it your own and make it better. 2 years of work, you'll have lesson plans that will just. And here's another thing I want to encourage you. I've talked to some folks about. David's put y'all ahead of the curve. Y'all shouldn't have any major course revisions. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but probably about 7 to 10 years. So if you invest the time now and create great lesson plans, you're going to ride those for a long, long, long time. So I hope this has clarified our lesson plans. When we get into the live section, I'm going to be talking about some other stuff. But today, I just really want to go over that basic fundamental philosophy, the rigor, relevance, and relationships. I wanted to remind y'all about the imprinting concept, because that's really kind of, if you go through this, you'll see it's really, really elemental in the way that I do things. And then I really wanted to explain to y'all the lesson plan, because if you first look at it, if you try to do one on your own, you might think I'm crazy. But hopefully now you understand, y'all, this is what makes you a great teacher. Remember when I was a cop, I wanted to be the best cop. I trained hard. I went to classes. I memorized all the code sections, even the ones we didn't use that much. I wanted to be a great cop. Don't you want to be a great teacher? Don't you want to be the best? And then, the better you get at this, also, a lot of your problems go away. Those kids that act up some, you get a better lesson. They don't act up as much. The kids that didn't do well on the test, you do better lessons. They don't mess up on the test as much. It just in the end, it makes you a better teacher. It makes your classroom go smoother. I can tell you, man, that last year I taught, forensics was like on autopilot. I can't tell you, there was days I just thought I'd forgotten things, but I had not. They were in my notes, they were in my PowerPoint, and I taught this class. God, I taught forensics that last iteration 60 plus times. So I want to encourage you guys, be the absolute best income teacher you can be. Your kids deserve it. You deserve it. You deserve to be awesome, right? So hopefully you learned something from me, and I'll see you guys in the live Q&A in just a moment.